title of that particular chapter was in interrogative. So just answer that particular interrogative, dear students. Listen that from the core of your heart. Should visit hit mommy? No, not at all. Why? I think the first query raised the beginning of lesson 5 was, are parents always right? So look at the answer of this particular query. Yes, of course. Parents are always right because their main concern is welfare of their children. So we must accept parents' viewpoint from the core of our heart, honestly, with 100% dedication. I think you are able to look at first query, that is, we must respect our parents from core of our heart and follow their advice honestly. We must follow their advice honestly. I think very clear, because they are always right. Their main concern is welfare of their children, safety of their children, protection of their children. I think very clear, there is no doubt in that. We look at the closing of the chapter. Second query was there. What was second query? That was, should we interfere with the ways of nature? No, never, not at all. We all are puppets in the hands of nature. So we must accept from the core of the heart what is given by the nature. I think very clear up to this particular point. So that is why Roger Skunks wanted that child must be with same kind of smell, because she wanted safety of that child. I think you are able to get the answers of this particular open question. Answer is, should visit hit mommy? No, not at all, never. And second query was, are parents always right? Yes. And third query you should be able to look at, that was, should we interfere with the nature or with the ways of nature? No, not at all. As Almighty knows what is right and what is wrong for us. So I think with this, you are very clear about the title, you are very clear about the queries. You are very clear about interrogative analysis of this particular chapter, that is lesson 5. Now it is time to start new chapter, that is lesson 6 of same book, that is Vistas. And the name of the chapter is On the Face of It. Just look at the title first. On the Face of It. Why is this chapter titled like that? If we look at the overview of this particular story, we will be able to look at, particularly this particular chapter is in the form of play. It's a play. Here we will find two main characters. One, you have to look at the old man, Mr. Lamb. And second one, Derry, a teenager. Two main characters of play. I think you are very clear up to this particular point. And if we look at brief overview of this particular story, both are physically challenged. Mr. Lamb was with thin leg because his actual leg was lost in the war. And the teenager, Derek, was the sufferer of negativity. The reason behind that was that guy was prey of some accident. Prey, prey of some accident. So that is why one part of his face was totally damaged. Very clear. Due to chemical. So both were handicapped. I think you are very clear up to this particular point. One had lost his leg, and small guy, he was with damaged face. Half of his face was burnt or burned. I think very clear up to this particular point. And the last sentence of overview of this story is Mr. Lamb had accepted his negativity. And teenager guy, Derek, had rejected that, and he had become quite aggressive, quite negative. I think very clear up to this particular point. You are very clear so far as the title is concerned. On the face of it, if we look at this particular word, face, it starts with the beginning of the chapter and it ends with the chapter only. Throughout the chapter, we will be able to highlight this particular point, that is the face, because the face of Derry was burnt face. I think very clear up to this particular point. So we are able to declare with 100% confidence the title of this particular story is 100% correct. This particular story in the form of play. I think very clear. So now just look at the micro introduction of the writer, Susan Hill. So if we look at this author or writer or playwright, she is an English author. Not was, she is. I think very clear. I think just look at the second sentence of the same, about the same lady. She is an author of fiction and non-fiction assignments. Fiction and non-fiction, I think you are very clear. So I think brief introduction of this writer is very clear. You are 100% clear about Susan Hill. English author, we look at her works. Author of fiction and non-fiction. I think very clear so far as micro introduction of author is concerned. You are very clear. Now just look at the next part. Before you read, this is a play featuring an old man and a small boy meeting in the farmer's garden. The old man strikes up a friendship with the boy, who is very withdrawn and defiant. What is the bond that unites the two? Just look at the booster paragraph of this chapter before you read. This is a play which highlights an old man and a small boy. I have already told you in the introduction that old man is Mr. Lamb, handicapped person, physically challenged. And small guy, Derek, was also physically handicapped. One was with thin leg, other was with burnt face. Meeting in the farmer's garden. Accidentally, both met in the garden. Farmer's garden means that garden was of Mr. Lamb, an old man. Farmer, I think very clear. Both met in Mr. Lamb's garden. Both means Mr. Lamb was owner of that particular garden, and former word, I think very clear. The old man strikes up a friendship with the boy, who is very withdrawn and defiant. I had already told you people that Mr. Lamb had accepted his negativity. Negativity means problem, the problem of fictitious leg, because his actual leg was just lost in war. His temperament, his attitude was quite positive after that handicap also, because he had accepted that, accepted from the core of his heart. I think very clear. But on the contrary, a small boy, Derek, temperament was very negative. He never wanted to meet anybody. He never wanted to talk with anybody. So while Mr. Lamb was able to meet that guy in his garden, he extended hand for friendship with that guy, who is very withdrawn and defiant. Withdrawn and defiant, just look at these two words, became very negative kind of personality. Rebellion kind of personality. Defiant, you have to look at the thing, this aggressive, rebellious. He never wanted to talk to anybody. He never wanted to just look at any human being. But Mr. Lamb extended his hand for friendship with that guy who never wanted to be friend of anybody, friend of any human being. What is the bond that unites the two? Just look at this query. What is the bond that unites the two? You are very clear about this small sentence. What is the basic relation that unites the two? The two here are an old man and a small boy. An old man, Mr. Lamb, small boy is Daddy or Derek. I think very clear, there is no doubt. Let us move forward. Just begin with scene 1. This particular lesson or this particular play is with scene 3. 3 scenes are there in this particular chapter. Scene 1 we have to start with. Just look at Mr. Lamb's garden. There is the occasional sound of bird song and of tree leaves rustling. There is footsteps are heard as he walks, slowly and tentatively. Look at this word, tentatively. Through the long grass. He pauses, then walks on again. He comes around a screen of bushes so that when Mr. Lamb speaks to him, he is close at hand and Daddy is startled. Just look at it. Just look at the beginning of this particular scene, that is scene number 1. Mr. Lamb's garden. Scene number 1 highlights the scene of Mr. Lamb's garden. And there is occasional. Occasional means sometimes. not in continuities, occasionally. The sound of bird song, chirping of bird, and of tree leaves rustling. And the sound of tree leaves is here heard. I think very clear up to this particular point. There is occasional sound of bird song and of tree leaves rustling. So that garden was highlighting the sound. What kind of sound? Occasional sound of chirping and rustling of leaves. So Daddy's footsteps are heard. Along with that, there was one more sound. It was footsteps of, the sound was of footsteps of Daddy. That is small guy, a teenager boy. As he walks slowly and tentatively, as he just moves very slowly and tentatively. Tentatively, if we look at this word, hesitantly. Through the long grass, he was walking hesitantly through the long grass. Because he had considered that that garden was lonely garden, I could be able to get satisfaction over there, because he never wanted to meet any human being. So that is why he entered in the garden to think over that particular point, that that was only, I think, deserted garden. No human being will be there in that particular garden. So that is why he had entered. He pauses. Pauses means stops. Then walks on again. He stops and then walks on again. For a moment, he had stopped. While he was moving, he had stopped. Then again he had started moving once again. He comes around a screen of bushes. He was able to observe a screen of bushes. Screen of bushes, I think very clear. A number of bushes are there in continuity. And I think the screen type, I think situation is seen or environment is seen. While bushes are there in continuity, we are able to observe that that just takes the shape of screen. Because without any gap, if number of bushes are there, we are able to look at this particular term, a screen of bushes. And he moves around a screen of bushes, so that when Mr. Lamb speaks to him, he is close at hand. There is startled. So immediately he was able to hear the sound of Mr. Lamb. Mr. Lamb speaks to him. He is close at hand. He is very near to that personality. He could never ever be able to see Mr. Lamb at that particular moment, because Mr. Lamb was behind a screen of bushes. I think very clear. And there is startled. He was able to hear the sound. While he was able to hear the sound of, or the noise of, or the voice of, or the instruction of Mr. Lamb, is startled. Startled here means extremely surprised or shocked. Why was he shocked at this particular moment? Because he never accepted that particular point that somebody should be there in that particular garden. And moreover, before entering in that garden, he thought and thought and thought, and he observed and observed and observed everything. And he could never ever be able to observe any human being in that garden. So that is why he had entered that garden. But while able to look at the command of Mr. Lamb, was shocked. Startled means shocked, dear students. You are very clear. Just look at the next. If we look at the next, before starting this particular part, let us look at this question. Read and find out. Who is Mr. Lamb? How does Derry get into his garden? We look at first part of this question, Mr. Lamb. Mr. Lamb is an old man, owner of the garden. He is physically handicapped. He had lost his leg in war. So that is why he is with fictitious leg, artificial leg. I think you are very clear about this personality. Mr. Lamb, old man, handicapped, owner of the garden, very fine personality. This fellow is of amiable temperament, very fine personality. Now just look at the second part. How does Derry get into his garden? Derry is a child, a teenager. Derry enters into Mr. Lamb's garden by climbing over the wall. He had not entered in that particular garden by just using the gate of garden. Entered by climbing over the wall. I think very clear so far as these two questions are concerned. Let us look at the play. Mr. Lamb. Mind the apples. Derry, what? Who's that? Who's there? Mr. Lamb. Lamb's my name. Mind the apples. Crab apples those are. Wind falls in the long grass. You could trip. Derry. I dash 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 there. I dash dash dash. I thought this was an empty place. I didn't know there was anybody here. Dash 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 dash. Just look at these 4 dialogues first. Mr. Lamb. Mr. Lamb commanded Derry that he must be very careful while he moves forward. Mind the apples. He wanted to highlight that particular point that he should not destroy apples. Should be very careful while he will move forward. He would not be able to look at the apples in a very different way. When Mr. Lamb commanded that he must be very careful while walks. The reason behind that is he never wants that the apples, he never wants apples to be in negative state. I think very clear so far as this exclamatory command is concerned. Mind the apples. Here Mr. Lamb instructs or commands Derry to be very, very careful, and he must be able to walk carefully. He must be able to look at the apples. Never wants the apple to be in a critical state. Derry, what? He was extremely surprised. We look at this, shocked even. To hear the noise of someone, because he had considered that that garden was without any human being. Just look at his next query. Who's that? I wanted to highlight that particular point, that speaking. Who was speaking? He wanted to highlight that. Who was there? He wanted to highlight the next query. who was there to highlight that particular sentence? Was just using WH family words. What? Who's that? Who's there? Because he was startled to hear that command, command of Mr. Lamb. Because he had entered the garden by thinking that particular point that nobody was there in the garden. 100% sure he had seen everything. So that is why instead of entering from the gate, he had climbed over the wall to be in the garden. I think very clear. Just look at the reply of Mr. Lamb. Lamb's my name. Mr. Lamb replied that Lamb was his name. Again instructed that fellow to be very careful while moving. He wanted to highlight that particular message that we must take care of apples. We must not interrupt apples while walking. Crab apples, those are. It highlighted that particular point that the apple which were fallen due to windfall, crab apples. Note down the meaning, crab. Crab means raw apples. Think very clear. It is green, and I think we look at the things raw. Green colored apples are in raw state. Those are. Wind falls in the long grass. I wanted to highlight this particular point. Wind falls in the long grass. You could trip. Wind falls. Just look at the meaning. Here, if we look at the meaning of this word, it means unexpected gain in the long grass. Unexpected gain. Why wind falls? Word highlighting unexpected gains. The reason behind that was while apples used to be in proper growth, Mr. Lamb would have to pluck the apples from the tree. He was able to get the benefit. What was the benefit? Because due to slow, I think strong blowing air, apples were automatically fallen. Apples had automatically fallen. So that is why wind falls. Means unexpected gain in the long grass. Wanted to highlight that particular point that number of apples were there in the long grass. Because apples had fallen due to fast moving air. You could trip. Wanted to instruct that guy that he could trip. Trip here means fall. Wanted to highlight that particular point that the way was not smooth due to, I think, fast moving air. Apples had fallen automatically. He was able to get the benefit of just getting raw apples automatically without plucking those due to, I think, fast blowing wind. So he wanted to highlight that particular point that that guy should not destroy apples by just keeping his feet on those apples. He wanted to highlight. I think at this particular, these two sentences are very clear. 2 or 3 sentences. Dairy. Now just look at the condition of dairy here. He was quite surprised because he could never think on that particular line that somebody to be able to interrupt him in that garden. Very clear. So that is why he was confused to listen the sound of Mr. Lamb, or was just surprised or shocked to listen the instruction of Mr. Lamb. I thought this was an empty place. I was very confused. So that is why dash 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 is highlighted, saying that he was there. He wanted to highlight that because he thought that that garden was an empty place, and he was 100% sure that no human being would be there in that particular garden. So that is why he had entered that garden. He wanted to highlight that particular. But at this particular point, he is very confused. Just move forward, dear students. Look at the next. Mr. Lamb, that's all right. I'm here. What are you afraid of, boy? That's all right. Just look at the words of Mr. Lamb here. Mr. Lamb was highlighting very fine words. Highlighting, it's okay. To just highlight that particular point that he was there. And he had raised the query that why that guy was afraid of. That's all right. He wanted to highlight that particular point that there was no problem. If he had entered the garden, he must be satisfied. He shouldn't get afraid of anything. Here, Mr. Lamb wanted to console that particular guy. I think very clear. Dairy. I thought it was empty, dash, 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 and empty. Here, that small boy is highlighting that particular point that he thought that that garden was empty. Again, highlighted that particular point that he thought that that was an empty house. Then you are able to look at this particular point that house was also there. Outside the house, there was a big garden, was a gated house and the gated garden. But that fellow had entered to the garden by just climbing over the wall, by thinking that nobody was there in the garden. Because he wanted to be away from human beings. He never wanted to be in the company of human beings. By thinking that particular point that people would make fun of his handicap. I think you are very clear up to this particular point. It's time to close the lecture. Before closing my lecture, I want to highlight very fine sentence. Physically handicapped person must be brave. They shouldn't criticize themselves. They should be brave enough to do what they can do, to be very frank. And moreover, people or society must not irritate them by acting and reacting in a negative way. So with this, it's time to close the lecture. Any query, any doubt, you possess the right to ask at any moment. Thank you. Thanks a lot.